Have a problem with your jakes? Or perhaps are just wondering how they work? In this video we're going to be discussing how the system works, the concepts behind it, and how to troubleshoot it. In this video I'm going to be talking about the fundamentals of jake brakes, how they work, and how to properly troubleshoot them, at least on CAD engines, the exact proper troubleshooting, and how to try to troubleshoot them without needing really any specialty dealer tooling. Okay? Now before we start the video, I want to say thank you to Benjamin for sending the channel $20. If you would like to help support the channel in the making of these videos, it is adeptape@yahoo.com, on PayPal, and on to the video. Okay, so most mechanics and most drivers are somewhat familiar with jake brakes, at least how they work to some extent, and kind of the principles behind them. Now that's not true with all drivers, and if you're a new mechanic, maybe you're only somewhat familiar with them. But I'm going to try and explain the principles behind how it works, and the better you understand the system, the easier the troubleshooting of the system can be. Okay, so let's just start off with a few concepts here. So what is a jake brake, or compression brake as Cat calls it? Well, it is an engine brake that uses your piston's ability to build air pressure to actually slow down the crankshaft. Now why is slowing down the crankshaft important? Well, to save brakes and to help slow your truck down, your truck most likely has jake brakes, and jake brakes are much different than an exhaust brake. An exhaust brake merely caps or restricts exhaust flow. A jake brake, if you think about it, your wheels are connected to your crankshaft. Now, you're probably thinking, no they're not. Well, yes they are, because your wheels are bolted to the axles inside your differential. Your differential is then bolted to your drive shaft. Your drive shaft goes into your transmission, and your transmission input shaft, at least if you have a clutch, is bolted directly to your flywheel. Now what's your flywheel directly bolted to? The crankshaft. So there's a complete chain between your crankshaft to your wheels. So let's say the Incredible Hulk were to grab your crankshaft when your truck's going down the road. It would stop your wheels. Well, it would probably break your U-joints or something. But the principle is, anywhere along that chain between the crankshaft, transmission, assuming the transmission's in gear, the U-joints in the drive shaft, the differential, the axles, the wheels, it's all one system. So slow down any one of those chains in the system, it will slow down your wheels. It'll also slow down your engine speed. So how do you slow down the crankshaft? Well, the pistons and the connecting rods are bolted to the crankshaft, and they're spinning. So if you can slow down the pistons, you can slow down the crankshaft, which then slows down your wheel speed. So how do you do that? Well, you need to make the pistons produce lots of effort, but then not produce any power. So in order to build pressure for combustion, your piston will go up in the cylinder. I'll show you a video if this concept is unfamiliar to you. So here we have a CAD engine. There's your crankshaft where your flywheel would bolt to. And if you rotate it, you're going to be moving the piston up in the cylinder, which that volume of air will be getting compressed. And as it's compressed, it will build very high pressure, which takes a lot of energy to do. Okay, and that is very similar to, let's say, a bike pump. So a bicycle pump is similar to an engine in that it has a piston and it's in a cylinder, and as it compresses, it takes energy to compress the air. So what you're doing, the same as a bike pump, is the same as a piston. You are drawing air into a cylinder. You're then compressing that air to very high pressures, and then typically fuel is injected, and that compressed air and fuel is ignited. It produces power, the piston goes back down and drives the crankshaft. Well, if you're going down a hill, you're picking up speed due to gravity. And you want to turn that piston, instead of producing power and speeding up your wheels, you actually want it to slow down the wheels. So how do you do that? Well, you make it compress all that air. And anyone that's used a bike pump knows it's harder, especially the higher that pressure gets, to build air pressure. So as the air pressure builds, you're restricting that piston from reaching top dead center. And you're creating stored energy because that air is under pressure. The same thing as if you let the air out of a tire, that's stored energy. So if you were to just compress the air and then not ignite it, well, when the piston goes to TDC, it's going to start drawing down. The stored energy in that air is going to help push the piston down. So you haven't really used that much energy. You've just compressed it, and then the stored energy would help push the piston back down. So that's where the Jake brake comes in. So what the Jake brake does is you store all that energy. The ECM's not firing your injector to create power. What the Jake brake does is it opens your exhaust valve. Now why does it do that? Because you have all that stored energy. If you open the exhaust valve, it lets all that pressurized air out of the cylinder. So you have used all this energy to help slow down your crankshaft, and opposed to storing that energy and then pushing the piston back down, it releases the energy, the stored air pressure. That air pressure then exits the exhaust, and that's where that Jake brake sound comes from. That is uncombusted compressed air that's getting released from your cylinders, and that slows down your wheel speed. That's basically how the Jake brakes work. Okay, so now we have an overview of how the Jake system works, at least in principle. Now we are going to be discussing the components that actually control the Jake system working. So there's 3 different systems that control the Jakes, and they're electrical, hydraulic, and mechanical. And you need all 3 in order for them to function properly. Now I'm going to be going through the components, and then after that I'll be kind of talking more about specific troubleshooting and how to help identify what it could potentially be. So I'll start with the switch. So you have a Jake switch. Typically on a truck it's an on-off switch, and then you have 3 settings. It could be 1, 2, 3. It could also be low, medium, and high. 1 being low, 2 being medium, 3 being high. So here we're looking at a standard engine brake Jake setup where you have an on-off switch, and then you have your selector switch, meaning you are going to operate on low, medium, or high. Low being 1, medium being 2, and high being 3. Now, 1 and 2 are different circuits. 3 is actually just both of the circuits at the same time. So what do those mean? Well, what that is it's a signal that when you switch it to on, it then sends that signal to the 1, 2, or 3 circuit, which then sends the signal to the ECM, the engine ECM. The engine ECM sees that circuit signal and then turns on some solenoids. And the Jake solenoids, there are 3 of them if you're running an electronic cat engine, meaning like a C15 or 3406E, a C13 or C11, an MXS, C15, pretty much any of the electronic electric unit injector cat truck engines. And even if you're not running a cat, the system's going to operate very similarly. But I specialize in cats, so that's what we're going to be discussing. So let's talk about some confusing terminology cats decided to use. So what we're looking at here is a single turbo C15 from the intake side. And you'll notice I have the numbers 1 and 2 over some of the Jake housings. On the left side we have cylinders 1 and 2. In the center we have 3 and 4, and in the right side of the picture we have 5 and 6. So there's actually to the ECM only two solenoids. There's solenoid number 1, which is the center solenoid, and solenoid number 2, which are the outer solenoids. Okay, so you could see that you had solenoid 1 and solenoid 2. Even though solenoid 2 is actually 2 solenoids, and it doesn't cover, it's not in the where you would think solenoid 2 would be. It's actually over cylinders 1 and 2 and 5 and 6. And solenoid 1 is actually over cylinders 3 and 4. That's the way Cat termed it. So that's good to know up front. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so where does the oil come from? Well, the oil gets supplied through your rocker arms. And what those solenoids do is when they energize, they keep oil pressure in that Jake housing. Now you might be thinking, okay, well, how can one solenoid control 2 cylinders? Because, you know, if you think about it, cylinders 1 and 2, or 3 and 4, or 5 and 6, they're not firing at the same time. So if you're energizing that solenoid, which is going to pop the exhaust valve when it needs to, how does it know when to pop the exhaust valve? Well, let me show you. So looking at our Jake housings, there's a small plunger that sits over the intake rocker arm. Now what happens is when the solenoid is energized, that housing fills with oil, and then when the injector rocker arm moves up, it will push that plunger in, which then sends pressure over to the piston on the other side for the exhaust, which then will pop the exhaust valves open. So you could see there that you have a small piston-like item that sits on these Jake housings. And what that does is when the injector rocker arm pivots up, it will actuate that piston, which then forces the oil pressure to open that exhaust valve. So even though your solenoid is electrical and controlled by the ECM, your ECM actually doesn't tell the Jake when to fire. All it's doing is closing the oil from basically escaping those housings, which then is fired by the injector rocker arm. That's what conducts the timing for your Jake circuit. Okay, so that kind of covers the rationale for how Cat makes these systems work. So you have an electrical signal coming from your switch. It then goes to the ECM. The ECM energizes the solenoids that you have selected, and then the solenoids are fired by oil pressure, which is supplied to them through the rocker arms, and then the timing of the exhaust valve popping is by the injector rocker arm. Okay, so that's basically the system. Now let's talk about the troubleshooting. Okay, so when troubleshooting these systems, you kind of have to go one of 2 paths, and then one of those paths diverges into 2 directions. So the first fork in the road is, do you have any check engine lights when these Jakes are supposed to be coming on? You know, do you flick it on, you know, coming down a hill, let up on your throttle, Jakes are supposed to kick in, maybe they do for a second, maybe they don't, but you notice your check engine light's coming on. Maybe you have a way to read the check engine light through either blink codes or a scanner. If you do, you might see some electrical circuit problems with your Jakes. If your Jakes aren't coming on, but you don't have a check engine light, well, then that leads to the path where there's another fork in the road. So if you're getting a check engine light on, that basically means you have an electrical problem between the ECM and the solenoids. Now, if your Jakes are not coming on and you do not have a check engine light, well, that could be mechanical or it could be electrical, but the electrical is going to be between the ECM and the switch, not the ECM and the solenoids. Because the ECM and the solenoids, the ECM monitors that circuit. If it sees a short or an open in that circuit, it'll usually throw a check engine light. So if you have a check engine light, we're going to go through that troubleshooting first. Okay, so we're looking at a download here. And if you're getting your Jake codes, you can have low, high, retarder, current low, current high, medium, current high. And it might have numbers for the retarder circuits as well. Low and high is your number 1 solenoid, and medium high is your number 2 solenoid, which is actually 2 solenoids as we discussed before. So current low would be an open, and current high would be a short, meaning more power is drawn. Now, if you can hook up to CAT-ET, or perhaps you have a scanner, there's a status field that can show whether the retarder is on or off, and if it is on, it'll say if it's in low, medium, or high. That's really good to have if you are not getting a check engine light, because then you can see if you're getting a signal from the switch back to the ECM. Now let's discuss the wiring diagram. So here we basically have the circuit to and from the ECM. So starting on the OEM side, from pin 5, the ECM sends out the accelerator pedal ground circuit, then goes through the retarder on-off, and then it goes from the low or medium and back to the ECM. So the ECM will say low if it sees a signal on the low. It'll go medium if it sees a signal on the medium, and if it sees signals on both, it's on high. That's how that works. When it sees that signal, it then sends the appropriate current to the solenoids on the ECM side, and it'll either supply solenoids 1 or solenoid 2 with current to energize those solenoids. So you can see the numbers here. If you suspect something wrong with the circuits, you'll want to look at the corresponding circuit and the pins and try to figure out whether you're not picking up a signal, or if you are, maybe you have a problem with the wiring from the ECM. So this is your P1 connector. This will be where the wiring goes up to your solenoids to the injector harness, which is the connector here, which is typically a 12-pin connector that goes through your valve cover base. Now, depending on which model you have, you might have a Jake solenoid that looks like that, or you might have a Jake solenoid that looks like this. This is the older model solenoid with the push-on style pins. Now you can ohm these solenoids out, and they should all read about the same. Just disconnect them and ohm them out. All of these are at around 10.6 ohms. If one's way out, you may have a bad solenoid. Okay, so if you've gone through, it's not electrical, your ECM's picking up the signal, but your Jake's still not working, well, then you have a mechanical problem. And typically, if you have a mechanical problem, it's going to be on, maybe one of the Jake housings. You're not usually going to have all the Jakes not working, unless maybe someone's done an overhead recently and the overhead was done incorrectly. That can cause mechanical problems. What else to look for if you're looking for mechanical problems? So, if you have mechanical problems, first thing you're going to want to do is check the overhead. Check that your Jake settings are correct on the overhead, as far as the exhaust valve settings, and then your Jake settings itself. You want to look for damage or leaks in the Jake housings themselves. So it's a big metal housing. If you have physical damage to that housing, or perhaps a leak, that can cause an oil leak, which then will cause your Jakes not to work. You also want to look at the plungers that push out and pop the exhaust valve. Sometimes they get stuck open, maybe they got stuck closed. It's kind of hard to tell unless the engine's running and you can kick the Jakes on, but it's hard to do that unless you have 2 people. So the left side rocker arm, you can see the exhaust / Jake plunger here. If that's damaged, that will cause that cylinder Jake not to work. Now when the engine's running, you can look for huge leaks anywhere on the valve, around the valves. If the housings are leaking really bad, or one has physical damage, that can cause an issue, because if you're losing oil pressure, that's what supplies the hydraulic pressure to operate your Jakes. As far as troubleshooting it mechanically, it's mostly visual inspection and actually testing the circuits, okay? So that kind of covers pretty much all the Jake problems you're going to run into that are typical. If you have any other questions or comments, please leave them in the comments section, and thank you for watching the video.